For the third part, I have to reveal that in the early part of 2016, I was in a domestic violence and homeless shelter in Chicago. And all of a sudden, one day, everybody got called in on short notice and said we had to attend a mandatory meeting. This mandatory meeting was presumably to give us a training on communicable diseases. Now, one of the things I had done when I was in San Francisco is I had worked for a public sexual health clinic. And among the things we did was provide tuberculosis testing to people. And while I personally did not administer the test, I was an administrator, and part of my job was to know about certain aspects of the supplies and the requirements connected to the invoicing and the accounting for these supplies, including what it meant that we would administer tuberculosis tests when we had a specific qualified nurse who was understood and licensed and capable, a phlebotomist who knew exactly what she was doing when she was doing that and other kinds of tests. And part of what we had to learn about was the history of tuberculosis and what kinds of tests you administered and how, and what the potential risks were associated with the administering of that test and the disposal of the supplies, and how to coordinate all of those things in order to be safe. So when this emergency training or this emergency meeting was done, this mandatory meeting was done, and I was in this shelter, and I was the only white skinned woman in the shelter at the time. Everybody else was either African American or non first language speaker, Hispanic woman, and their children. And we were all in this mandatory meeting, and they were going to talk about communicable diseases. I did something that I won't say specifically what I did, but I didn't sign my name on the list. I signed another name, hoping it would raise a flag, because I knew that what was happening was wrong. And the training was supposed to be three parts. The first part was supposed to discuss tuberculosis. The second part was supposed to discuss hepatitis C. And the third part was supposed to discuss HIV. And so I'm sitting there with all of these other women, and they start talking about tuberculosis. And from the beginning, the man who, you know, it was such a sudden meeting that they didn't even have the equipment set up, that they had to hustle like really quickly to set the equipment up. And he claimed that he was a veteran. He claimed that he was a veteran of the United States. But the references to this training in the actual presentation said that it was from the Virginia Veterans Affairs Department. And I was like, why would you be having information from the Veterans Affairs Department administration from Virginia for something that was happening at the time? It was in Illinois. So I'm watching it, and then they start giving information on the history of tuberculosis and where it came from. And the thing is that what they were discussing about the history of tuberculosis was completely inaccurate. They were identifying strands and transmissions of tuberculosis that were not the ones that originally came to North America. And this automatically struck out to me because I'm looking around the room, and it's like, wait a second, you're talking about a you're talking about a communicable disease and the origins and the proliferation and distribution of this communicable disease and its impact on the United States, and hence how to treat it in a way that's completely inaccurate. And so after that, I sat there, I literally put my fingers in my ears, and I started like, I went like that during the time that they talked about hepatitis, because I wasn't even going to look at it. I was like, they're programming us. They're programming us. I know it sounds crazy, but it's like they're programming us. I can't even listen to it. It's completely misinformation. And so then the hepatitis ended, the hepatitis segment ended, and then he just stopped short of even doing the HIV. And then he left. Nobody said anything. I ended up getting kicked out of the shelter ostensibly for another reason. Nobody ever mentioned the sign-in sheet to me. Nobody ever responded. I actually wrote a grievance about my concerns about what had been presented and what had happened. Nobody's ever responded to me to this day. That summer, I was outside. I was on the street, and I got contacted one night about somebody, a friend of mine, that had been sick. And I was told they were sick in a specific manner, and I was asked to help deal with that. And it turned out, after I engaged with that they weren't talking about my friend. And they were actually talking about another part of the body, first of all, and it was somebody else. It was the person whose name I had put on that list when I was at the homeless shelter, when I was at the domestic violence shelter earlier in the year. There ended up being a public notice that I found a short time later about how that person was engaged in, let's put it this way, a public event and had to leave because this person had been identified as having a respiratory illness and needed treatment. Now, just so you know, this person is not African American and this person's not Hispanic. In some ways, this person looks a lot like me. We get mistaken for each other all the time. But at that time, all over Chicago, were African American women that were getting the flu. We're talking about the middle of the summer of 2016. What is the flu doing impacting women in homeless shelters throughout Chicago? Why are all of these women getting this really intense cough like they have the flu and having to go to that hospital because they have a respiratory illness? I believe they were trying to activate a biological weapon with the intent of promulgating a respiratory disease aimed and targeted at African American women. But because there were other racial demographics and specific name references that would have been on the target list that would have provided the primary vehicle for distribution, they had to scale it back. And they've had to adjust. It's like you create a program to release a biological weapon and you create a list of people that you need to target, but somebody that's not supposed to be on the list and it's not supposed to be a part of the dispersal pattern ends up on the list. What do you do then? Do you wait a year? Do you wait 2 years? Do you wait 3 years? The problem is they keep saying there's going to be another surge, there's going to be another wave, there's going to be another wave. Is this one of those take a hit now for a long-term gain? Are they specifically targeting particular racial and ethnic groups now, hoping to draw certain resources out and hook up certain kinds of securities that have certain time frames that are coming due later in order to twist and turn to other demographics? I believe that's absolutely exactly what they're intending to do. And I believe that the people who are actually the culprits of this and the actual intellectual authors of this biological warfare intend to present themselves as some sort of political salvation.